President Bill Clinton at the American Institute of Architects, Atlanta, Georgia.
A system that would make it possible, even preferable, to succeed at work and at home. Any society that forces people to make that choice is going to be diminished, either economically in the short run or profoundly socially in the long run. And I think if we should begin there. And then you just got to work at it. I mean, it's not so simple. You got to, but there are people who are good at what they do, and they need to be models. Shirley Jackson, the head of Rensselaer, former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in my administration, first African American woman to get a PhD in physics at MIT. People like that need to be seen as the rule, not the exception. And people like you should. We just got to keep going. A lot of this stuff is hard work, and people get tired of doing it. A lot of it, you just need a system. You say, we're going to work at this for 10 years, and after 10 years, we'll run the numbers up and equalize the outcomes, and that's what I think will happen.
Well, that's really encouraging, and as we move forward. You worked closely with the architects. You spoke about the presidential library. And can you share a little bit with us your experience with working with architects during the design?
I started working on the architecture of my library and presidential center in Arkansas in my second term. And I went through, Lord only knows how many architectural books I read and how many people I interviewed. Finally, I settled on Polchek firm because, for a number of reasons, but I'd studied a lot of the other work they had done that I thought was relevant to what I was trying to achieve. And then I began to meet with them, and somewhere in the middle of the process, one of them looked at me and said, "You are the worst client we ever had." And I said, "Why?" He said, because we've been gone for 6 months, and I changed one little line on one facet of this, and you saw it in 2 minutes, and you didn't like it, and you said, "Why are we doing this?" And nobody else does that. I said, "Well, I'm like you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in that building." And so I love the interface with the architects and how we kept trying to redesign it. And no matter how much you think about it, I won't say what it is, but I think there's one major flaw in the way the people flow options of my presidential library. And I don't blame the architects, I blame me. I just didn't pick it up. I had a much better sense of practically who would be doing what, where in the building. But I loved it. I mean, it was exciting. I always thought if I had another life to live, I'd like to have been an architect, particularly now in the age of climate change. And so I got to play with it in this one example. And I guess I wouldn't have been very good given how many gray hairs I gave people who were doing it. But it was really fun.
Well, that's great. It's awesome to kind of put an idea to bring it to reality.
It's amazing. I mean, I just obsessed. I go around asking. I have a friend who was an early partner in CGI who built the first carbon-free building in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, and I think it was the first one built in Europe. And I remember, before you give up on Greece, I'll tell you one story. I was in Athens one night several years ago when they built the second zero emissions office building in Athens, and it was getting dark in the summertime, so it was late. And there was still a line of cars more than a mile long, but people just wanted to drive by the building and see what it looked like. They're into this now. They're fascinated by design and execution and evidence that it works. And so, on balance, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of this.
Thank you. You spoke about inclusiveness and working together, partnerships. Can you talk a little bit about how that idea kind of came to you to create the Clip Global the Foundation and
yeah, I just figured, you know, when I left the office, when I was in presidency, I wanted to work on things I had cared about when I was president, where I could still have an impact. And I didn't want to spend a lot of time telling war stories or pontificating on World War II, which I could have no control. I don't mind telling people what I think, but I find it much more rewarding to actually get up every day and work on something where you can have an impact. And one of the things that I believed then, and still believe, is that we would never really turn the tide against climate change until we reached a tipping point in the number of decision makers who believed you could grow the economy faster by changing the way you produce and consume energy and local resources than by sticking with the current dead-end course. And so I started doing these projects. And very often, in the way our foundation works, we either have tried to find something we could change that would have a huge impact more or less immediately because people would want to follow it. An example of that is drastically driving down the price of AIDS drugs. The AIDS market was totally disorganized when I left office, and generic drugs were $500 a person a year. 10,000 in New York, but in America. But so when we analyzed it, it was obvious that their costs were nowhere near $500 a year, but it was a low volume business and an uncertain payment business because the American program PEPFAR and the Global Fund on HTV malaria hadn't been funded. So I went to the governments of Canada and Ireland. We started with them. And I asked if they would allocate $20 million a year to this. Nothing now. For 5 years. And they both said yes. Then we went to the major producers of AIDS medicine. And I said, look, you've got a terrible business model here. You're running a global epidemic as if you had a small town jewelry store. Low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment business, right? People want to look at more than one watch, more than one ring, and somebody might return the engagement ring and you lose the money. So I said, let's run this like a grocery store chain. Massive volume, low profit margin per unit, absolutely certain prompt payment. And here's my money. And they agreed, and so now, more than half the people on Earth who are alive because of AIDS medicine, including over 3/4 of the kids, get it off contracts we negotiated. And we try never to touch any of the money. So to do that, or if there is no money for it, then you have to take the harder path and develop a model that works and prove it and keep pushing it up the hill until enough people see it that they take it away from you, which is what you really want. The example of that is we have 85,000 farmers in Africa who on average farm an acre of land, and we work with them to get them better seed and fertilizer at lower costs, get their foods to market, basically do what agricultural experiment stations in America started doing in the Great Depression. And they have averaged almost triple their production and an even bigger increase in their income because we cut the cost. And it's awesome. I saw a woman in Tanzania who farmed 1 acre of land and had 7 children, and her production almost tripled of corn. She added soybeans. Her income was up about 500%, and all of a sudden all of her kids were in school for the first time ever. Now, if I had the money, I could do that not for $85,000, but for $850,000, or for $8 million. But I don't care if I do it, but I'd be thrilled if somebody would just take the model and run with it. But it's obvious what to do to save the small farmers, save the topsoil, avoid having all these people thrown off the land by premature mechanization that will destroy the topsoil. So we do that. The energy work we do is in that category. For example, we started this program called HEAL in Arkansas, with L'Oreal. L'Oreal has the largest manufacturer of women's eyeliner facility in the entire world in North Little Rock, Arkansas. And they offered to, first they retrofitted their whole operation to make it more energy efficient. And then they created a fund with the savings and financed their employees retrofitting their houses, making them more energy efficient. Employees took the savings, paid the loan back into a revolving fund. Then the employees had better quality of life and lower utility bills. There were fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and we had a funding system to help it. Some version of that we're now doing with several other employees in the state. And now the woman in Arkansas who developed this for me has gone to 6 or 7 other states, and they're beginning similar programs. We don't care if we do this all over America, but if this became a basic employee benefit for every company that could afford it, we could dramatically accelerate the retrofitting of homes to become more energy efficient, cleaner, lower their utility bills, and create capacity, which would avoid the question of what's the power source for your new generator. Look, and I love solar and wind and geothermal and biomass, and we work on that all over the Caribbean and South America. I'm all for it. But if you live in an environment where there's a big built environment and a heavy capacity already, which is the United States and many other places, you ought to go for the low-hanging fruit first and maximize efficiency. It's the most employment-intensive option. Create more jobs through retrofitting than you do with, if you build wind power, and America has enough capacity to electrify the country many times over just with wind. We just don't have the battery capacity, and the grid doesn't work because the wind blows basically where the people are not. So from basically from North Dakota's border with Canada down to the West Texas border with Mexico. So you got to increase that. I'm all for that, but we ought to maximize what we can get from efficiency first. It creates more jobs and jobs in places where people would not otherwise have them. Solar, and if you make the windmills in America, you can get 3,300 jobs for every $1 billion you spend. If you make the solar panels in America, whether it's solar thermal like the Avanpa project on the Nevada-California border, or just solar panels, you get about 1,900 jobs. If you do the retrofits right, you can get 8,000 jobs for $1 billion spent. So I think we should really maximize that, and it ought to be something that architects take great pride in, figuring out how to make a building more beautiful and more accessible. The Empire State Building alone created 275 jobs to reduce its emissions almost 40% and make it the oldest big building in the world with a LEED rating, 1931 building. So that's what I think.
There's many opportunities like that is, like you say, a low-hanging fruit to just asking the right question and taking a step toward it.
Like I say, it doesn't matter. In the case of this HEAL program, I would be shocked if our foundation could finally put 50 million Americans in it. But I would not be shocked if 50 million Americans were in programs like this. I'm just trying to develop something. I'd be only too happy to have the government fund 1 million other ones that do the same thing. I'm just trying to create a model that proves that you can replicate it over and over and over again, so people like you can figure out to do what you want to do, and you realize there's a way to finance it.
So speaking of job creation, small businesses, is the lifeblood, of our country and also of our profession. We have a lot of small businesses in architecture. What are your thoughts about global competitiveness, small businesses, U.S.-based small businesses in the global marketplace?
Well, I think the answer is there's more variation in small business. Some are highly competitive, some are not. Some do things for which there is a demand overseas, some do not. But I'll just give you 2 things I'd like you to think about. One is that and you should see it in the context of all this debate now over these trade issues in Washington. If we did as well as the Germans do in getting small and medium-sized enterprises into international trade, America would go from being highly skeptical about trade to being in favor. We have failed to, and it's not just a government failure, it's a consciousness problem too. But I recommend you look at every other country in the world and see how many architectural firms do business outside their own borders, and ask what are they doing that we aren't, and how can we do this? Because I think that's very, very important. Secondly, I think that we should, this would be very helpful, particularly for smaller businesses. The Germans don't have an unemployment system that works like ours does. They have an unemployment system that before they start paying unemployed people 60% of their former salaries to be out of work, they'll actually, when the unemployment starts creeping up, they'll actually first give some money to the firm, in this case, let's say an architectural firm, say, I know your business is down, here's some money, keep these people on the payroll. It costs a lot more money to bring people back than to keep them there in the first place. So those two things, I believe, would make a big difference, and they might have an especially strong impact in your work. For example, you can think of what you could do if, after the last crash, if you'd been given a year where nobody had to be laid off, because instead of taking your unemployment taxes and paying people 60% of their income, it gave it to the firm, and then you all can figure out what to do. Maybe everybody worked for 80% of what they were having until you got back. Then you could have done a lot of pro bono work. We could have retrofitted the entire public housing stock in New York City with architects helping if we had that kind of system. So I think we need to learn more about what other countries do that help firms like yours and see how we can adapt it for America to make it work.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. President, for spending the time with us.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to join us for lunch and meet the exhibitors at the AIA Expo. The entrance to the expo hall